So today we're going to discuss what is, in my opinion, the single strongest unit in the entire Guard Codex, point for point. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, the strategy focused 40k channel, where we're all about making the most out of our miniatures on the tabletop. Today we'll be continuing in our Imperial Guard series, analysing all of the units and combos that the Guard have access to, but you could consider this a bit of a general video as well, as I honestly think that this could be the best point for point unit in all of 40k. So a bold statement then, let's see if I can back it up. Just to clarify, when I do use the word best here, I mean best point for point, as in you get more value back from the points that you put in from this unit than you'd get virtually anywhere else. And because he's a single character model who uses one specific psychic power, you can only really ever have one copy of him working to full efficiency. So this isn't the sort of thing that you can spam to win your games effortlessly. But I've been including this guy in my list since the codex dropped, and as of chapter approved he's now got even cheaper. I am talking about the Astropath with Sachi Maelstrom, a 15-point little murder machine that I honestly wouldn't build a single competitive guard list without including. The utility you can get out of these 15 points is just immense. I honestly think it's one of the easiest ways that any guard player can improve their list, so let's see if I can sell you on his merits. So Astropaths then. At some point fairly soon we'll cover all of the guard psychic powers and have a look at the Primaris Psyche and Astropath, but for the purposes of this video we're just going to focus on this one Astropath and he'll take Psychic Maelstrom. He's an elite's choice for Codex Imperial Guard, and you can take him as 15 points because you have the option to replace his telepathic stave with a las pistol. I would do this every time because he's frankly rubbish in close combat and having a fancy stick isn't going to help him. He's a fairly nondescript character, weapon skill 5 up, ballistic skill 6 up, strength and toughness 3, 3 wounds, 1 attack, leadership 6 and a 6 up save. So about as bad a profile as you can get for an independent character. But this is fine. The only real thing that matters is his durability, as we're not going to be looking to get this guy into close combat, and hopefully we'll be screening him behind our own units, and his durability is kind of fine for a 15-point investment, similar to a commissar or platoon commander's. He can attempt to manifest one psychic power in the psychic phase, and deny one in the opponent's psychic phase, and he knows one psychic power from the Psychana discipline, in this case Psychic Maelstrom. So what does Psychic Maelstrom do? It's a warp charge 7 psychic power, so it'll be going off about 60% of the time. If manifested, you roll a d6, on a 2 up that unit suffers a mortal wound. If the mortal wound isn't negated, then on a 3 up it'll suffer another mortal wound, then a 4 up, then a 5 up, then a 6, so in theory you have up to the chance of doing 5 mortal wounds on one target. Obviously this very rarely happens, only 1.5% of the times that you successfully cast it, but I have had this go off twice and both times it was absolutely spectacular. There are 2 really great things about Psychic Maelstrom. The first is that it doesn't need line of sight, so you can happily sit behind out of line of sight in a ruin and cast it on a nearby enemy unit. The second is that it doesn't need to target the nearest unit, so you can use it to snipe characters and stack a few mortal wounds on them, even if they are screened by other enemy units. And compared to a lot of other targeted smite abilities, it's really quite a potent power. On average, if you do the maths for this wounds cascade, you'll actually do around 2.5 mortal wounds to your opponent. This math is of course slightly distorted by the very low chance of rolling very high indeed and causing 4 or 5 mortal wounds. In general, in my experience, this guy tends to cause between 0 to 3 mortal wounds, with a fairly even distribution between the lot of them. Of course you do have to succeed with the psychic power for this to take effect, which is only just under 60% odds. But that still means that this guy is kicking out an average of around 1.5 wounds per turn, and as they're mortal wounds on literally whichever enemy unit in the game that's in range, this means that on average he will often pay for his points cost just in one single cast. There's almost nothing that isn't worth pointing him at. Obviously things like Gretchen or Chaos Cultists and things aren't a particularly efficient use of mortal wounds. He's far better off scraping wounds off tactical squads, other heavily armoured single wound infantry, pretty much any vehicle in the game, particularly things with a high points per wound cost such as Leviathan Dreadnoughts for example, or Imperial Knights, but particularly characters due to him being able to target them even though they aren't the closest. Characters often have some of the highest points per wounds cost in the entire game, and being able to significantly injure a character before it even reaches your lines can often be the difference between either killing that character or letting it live later in the game. There was a game when a demon prince was behind some plague bearers. I managed to get a very lucky cheeky wound off him with a sniper rifle, and then 2 wounds off with my Astropath. On my following turn, I was able to get 1d6 damage result through, because that was the only unit that could target him with a missile launcher, and I rolled a 5, killing the demon prince, which would not have been possible if the Astropath hadn't been there to take those mortal wounds off him. So that's my main reason for using him. He's just a mortal wound generation machine that's really undercosted for what he does, and he's incredibly easy to use, being able to target exactly what he wants within that 18 inches, and not even needing line of sight, so you can just hide him in a ruin in your deployment zone and use him as a counter-attack unit to put some mortal wounds on enemy heavy hitters coming in. But his value doesn't end there. We mentioned before that he can deny a psychic power. Now often guards lists might not be using too many psychers, or you might be allying in guard to support a different army such as Imperial Knights or something. Over tournaments over the last year, I've often been running my 3 Knights and Tank Commanders list, and this Astropath within that list provides a very important denial, which if you're facing an opponent who relies on psychic, you can just throw it at the most important psychic power that they're about to cast each turn. I've had this guy either dispel Jinx or Doom from a Farseer or Warlock when they were targeting one of my Knights, and I can categorically say that that gave me a much better chance of winning the whole game, as it meant that the Eldar player actually had to devote lots of firepower to killing that Knight, rather than just a few easy shots that they would have taken if they'd got both of those powers off at once. Obviously it doesn't always work for the dispel, but guard generally have quite a lot of command points available, and re-rolling a dispel dice against a key spell is a potentially great value source of using your command reroll, as is for that matter re-rolling Sachi Maelstrom when you roll a 1 on the first dice roll. He does potentially have another quite useful ability in a foot guard list, which is the Astropath's ability to remove cover for a unit when you're targeting that unit with an infantry squad. This could actually make your gun line a little bit more efficient if you're moving infantry squads forward to take the middle ground, particularly now we're seeing so many Space Marines in the meta at the moment. Having them not save on a 2-up is really quite handy. However, I would certainly treat this as a secondary ability. I'd really just focus on getting the most out of that Psychic Maelstrom and Deny, and treat this as a nice optional extra that you might be able to make use of. So how would I use my Murder Astropath on the battlefield? There are actually really quite a lot of different ways that you can play with this guy, depending on your opponent. Firstly, if denying psychic powers is crucial, it could just be worth sending him out to the front of your battle line, and maybe hide somewhere out of line of sight or behind one of your own units. This will mean that the opponent has the least possible zone that they can cast psychic powers, as your own psychic deny bubble will be further. I've done this to good effect against Eldar quite a lot, and he usually does get to deny. That's particularly for shorter range powers like Doom and Jinx. The psychers do need to get at least somewhat close. Unless you're really focusing on getting that denial in the right place, I generally deploy him somewhere towards the front of my deployment zone, either screened by infantry if that will suffice, say if the enemy doesn't have any snipers, or ideally somewhere like the bottom corner of a ruin where he can't be seen, but can still potentially be used as a bunker to cast Psychic Maelstrom from. If your army is advancing towards the enemy, then he can join in the advance, and he can quite literally advance as well, as you can of course advance and cast psychic powers without any penalty. Usually if he gets into the midfield, he'll have plenty of decent choice targets to strip mortal wounds from, and from there I'd usually just try and hover him about 18 inches from the enemy, just burning some mortal wounds away every turn. If the opponent has sniper weapons that you think will easily take him out, or if the opponent is coming to you, then I'd strongly consider keeping him safe in your deployment zone and just using him as a counter-attack asset to activate his mortal wounds trimming abilities on whichever big nasties your opponent sends your way. In general, anything that's pushing forward tends to be fairly well armoured and well defended, so often tends to be an efficient choice for taking mortal wounds off. Whether it's a big knight or a demon engine or a flyer, they're all good targets. As your units start to die around you a bit, he can also be really quite a good choice for holding objectives. A cheap character with the advantage of being immune to shooting besides sniper weapons makes a great objective holder, particularly for those defend objectives. So sometimes it might be more use to let him camp on an objective in the late game, and perhaps free some more of your forces to go and take the fight to the enemy. Now he does have a couple of weaknesses. Firstly, it is relative vulnerability to sniper fire. It is perfectly possible to lose him from one round of shooting from a squad of snipers, such as Eliminators or Eldar Rangers or something, as he only has 3 toughness, 3 wounds. I think the main thing to remember with this is that even if you do get him shot in one round by one of these units, he's honestly so cheap that in terms of a points for points basis, your opponent's units are rarely going to be efficient shooting at him, just because they cost so much points themselves. For example, if a unit of eliminators one-rounds him, which in all honesty they are quite likely to do, then essentially you have had a 72-point unit distracted for that entire turn, killing just a 15-point unit. They'd have to be firing unimpeded for 5 turns straight to make their points back, so if he does get shot down by sniper fire once every few games, it's not really the biggest deal. Of course you can play around that quite easily by keeping him out of line of sight on ground floor ruins and the like, and using him as more of a counter-attack beast than an advancing threat. The second slight worry that you can sometimes experience with Astropaths is that they can die to a single Perils attack, and that would mean that they explode, inflicting mortal wounds around them. This has happened to me I think once or twice while using this guy, so it's definitely worth thinking about keeping a command point spare, for if he does suffer Perils and he rolls that dreaded 3 on the amount of mortal wounds he takes. Obviously this is a very rare event indeed. He will kill himself with Perils around 1 or 2% of the times that he casts, and you can mitigate it with command points, but it can potentially be quite a big hindrance if it does happen in the middle of your army. The easiest way is if it looks like you're winning the game, and a bad Perils explosion could actually turn a win into a loss, then I'd probably just either not cast with him, or use his Astropath's mini smite, where you just cast on 1d6 and a smite goes off on a 5 or 6. It's generally going to be more sensible. I honestly wouldn't get too hung up on that though, it's an incredibly rare event, and one that you can still mitigate with command points. So that's the unit and how much value he is to the army. It is a very rare game indeed for me, where he doesn't make a significant dent in the army for that 15 points. Realistically, he only needs to take 1 or 2 wounds off vehicles the whole game long to be worth the investment. We'll end with a few fun stories about what my Astropath has achieved over the last couple of years. He's managed to snipe the enemy warlord twice now. Once was a Tau Fireblaze that he managed to roll 4 mortal wounds for, which killed him instantly, and this led to us winning the game because it really came down to the last victory point or two to make the decision. He's taken out a shield captain by rolling the full 5 mortal wounds once, and burns that custody jetbike shield captain from the sky. He had already taken a couple of wounds damage. Over one particular game that I wound up losing, he really excelled himself with his mortal wound rolls and managed to do 10 wounds to Iron Hand's Leviathan Dreadnoughts over the course of the game. He did more damage to those things than some of my Lehman Russes did, which is just hilarious because those Lehman Russes cost around 10 times his value. Obviously these are slight exceptions to the rule. In general he will just kick out a few mortal wounds each turn, but that's more than enough to justify his inclusion in the list, and is just another scary damage dealing asset that your opponent has to worry about. Honestly, I'd really recommend trying him yourself. For 15 points you're really not giving up that much, and he is a really fun unit to use in game. I honestly think that he might be one of the single strongest units in all of 40k for his points. I was happily running him at 26 points, and now Chapter Approved has dropped those points, so it's only 15 points to include in your list. There aren't many units that I'd say could happily have their points cost doubled and I'd still run them, but he is one of them. So let me know your thoughts and opinions on this guy down in the comments below. I know there might be more important units in the guard list in terms of actually winning us games, but in this video I was just focusing on who is probably point for point the most valuable unit. If you can think of any contenders, please let me know. That would also be a fun discussion. I'll look forward to reading those comments. We'll be continuing our guard series in a couple of days' time with a review of the anti-infantry murder machine, the Wyvern, so stay tuned if you'd like to see that. If you're enjoying the channel's content, then please feel free to support me on Patreon, the voluntary subscription service, where you can give a bit of financial support to the channel and help let me focus on 40k tactics videos as a bit more of a legitimate part of my life, rather than something I'm just doing as a hobby. Thanks again for listening. I'll look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.